The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, and by Wednesday, Wilhelmina Carver had sold nearly everything she owned. It was not the kind of decision a woman made lightly, not in Knoxville, Tennessee, where propriety sat on every front porch like a watchful neighbor, and every choice a woman made was measured against the invisible ruler of what was expected. Wilhelmina had been measured her entire life and found herself perpetually a fraction of an inch off from what the ruler demanded. Too tall, her aunt said. Too quiet in company and too loud when she had something to say. Too bookish for her own good and far too stubborn for anyone else's. But that letter changed the measurements entirely. It had come from a land surveyor's office in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, and it confirmed what Wilhelmina had suspected for 6 years since her mother's death. The 40 acres of land that Cecilia Carver had purchased by mail in 1861, scraping together every cent she had earned as a seamstress, were still legally registered in the family name. The land had never been claimed in person. It had never been built upon. It sat in the high desert at the edge of a valley her mother had described to Wilhelmina, with the kind of reverence most women reserved for scripture. Cecilia Carver had clipped an advertisement from a newspaper in 1858, 2 years before the country tore itself apart at the seams. The advertisement described land in the New Mexico Territory, fertile valley soil, clean mountain water, the promise of something new in a country that was expanding westward, with the urgency of a man outrunning his own past. Cecilia had been a widow by then, her husband taken by a fever, and she had worked her fingers to the bone in her small seamstress shop, saving for years with single-minded determination. She had always spoken of that land as if it were already a farm, already alive with corn and sunflowers, already home. She had never made it there. The war came, and then hardship, and then the slow unraveling of a woman's health under the weight of too many years of too little rest. Cecilia Carver died in the winter of 1872, when Wilhelmina was 22 years old, leaving her daughter a small trunk, a collection of fabric scraps, and a folded piece of paper with the land surveyor's number and a handwritten note that read, "This is yours now, Mina. Do not let anyone tell you that a woman cannot build something of her own." Wilhelmina had been carrying that piece of paper for 6 years. She had tried, in those 6 years, to be reasonable. She had worked in Knoxville, first as a school teacher and then in a dry goods store, saving money steadily and carefully. She had endured 2 courtships that went nowhere because the men in question wanted a wife who would let them lead without question, and Wilhelmina had never in her life been able to pretend she had no opinions. She had read every newspaper article she could find about the New Mexico Territory. She had written letters to the land office and received polite, bureaucratic replies. And all the while, her mother's dream had lived inside her chest like a coal that never fully cooled, warm and insistent. When the letter arrived confirming the land was still hers, Wilhelmina did not hesitate. She did not consult anyone. She simply made her plans. By Thursday morning, she had purchased a strong-sided wagon and 2 good mules from a farmer on the outskirts of town. By Saturday, she had packed the wagon with everything practical: flour, dried beans, salt pork, a cast-iron skillet, several quilts, her mother's old trunk, 3 changes of clothing, her teaching books, and a Winchester rifle she had purchased from the general store with the last of her savings. The store clerk had looked at her with a particular expression that managed to combine concern, amusement, and skepticism all at once. "You know how to use one of those?" he had asked. "I will learn," Wilhelmina had replied, and that was that. She left Knoxville on the first Monday in April, 1878, with her 2 mules named Samuel and Goliath and her wagon loaded and covered with oilcloth against the spring rain, and she drove west without looking back. The first mountain range nearly broke her. She had not fully understood, sitting in Knoxville reading newspaper articles, what it meant to cross the Appalachians alone in a wagon. The roads were poor and the grades were steep, And there were 2 days in North Carolina where the rain came down so hard that she could not see the road in front of her. And she sat under the oilcloth with the rifle across her lap, listening to the thunder crack and roll through the mountains like God rearranging furniture. Samuel and Goliath were steady animals. God bless them. But even steady animals had their limits, and she spent half a day one afternoon coaxing them up a slope so muddy that both mules had lost their footing twice. She made friends with a farm family in a small Tennessee community who fed her a hot supper and let her sleep in their barn, and the wife pressed a jar of preserves and a wedge of cornbread into her hands in the morning, with the matter-of-fact generosity that existed in certain parts of the country, where people understood that the road was long and no one made it entirely alone. Wilhelmina thanked her with genuine warmth and drove on. By the time she crossed into Arkansas, she had been on the road for 3 weeks, and she was already a different woman than she had been in Knoxville. Her hands had hardened, and her shoulders had grown strong from managing the reins over long hours. She had learned to load and fire the Winchester with reasonable accuracy, spending evenings practicing at stumps and fence posts. She had learned to read the sky for weather and to choose her campsites near water but above the flood line. She had learned that loneliness, in certain lights, had a quality almost like freedom. Arkansas was flatter and kinder to the mules, and she made better time through it, stopping at small towns to resupply and gather information about the road west. People were uniformly curious about a woman traveling alone, and their curiosity expressed itself in different ways. Some were protective, offering advice about dangerous passes and settlements to avoid. Some were skeptical, asking repeatedly whether she had a husband or brother who would be meeting her somewhere ahead. Some were simply nosy, asking personal questions with a frankness that she found both exhausting and almost charming. She crossed the Arkansas River in late April and pushed into the Indian Territory, which required her to be careful and respectful and watchful, and she was all three. The territory had its own complicated and painful history that she understood in some measure from her reading, a history of displacement and broken promises that the government had made and then systematically violated, and she traveled through it with her head down and her manner quiet, and caused no trouble. She encountered a group of Cherokee men near a river crossing who regarded her and her wagon with calm, measuring eyes, and she greeted them in a direct and respectful manner, explaining where she was going. One of them, an older man with a long gray braid, had said something to his companion in his own language, and then told her in clear English that the ford was easier half a mile north. She thanked him sincerely and went north and crossed without incident. By the time she reached Texas and turned west toward the New Mexico territory, it was late May and the world had gone big and open and astonishing around her. The sky in Texas was not like the sky in Tennessee. The Tennessee sky was intimate, framed by hills and trees, a sky you lived under. The Texas sky was something you lived inside, a vast, indifferent blue that went on in every direction until it seemed like the earth itself was just an accident at the bottom of all that air. She would stop sometimes in the evenings when the light went orange and red and cast long shadows across the scrubland, and she would sit on the wagon seat and look at it until the first stars appeared, and she would think about her mother. Cecilia Carver had known from an advertisement in a newspaper that this land existed. She had sent money for it without ever seeing it, based entirely on the faith that it was worth reaching. Standing in the immensity of the western landscape, Wilhelmina understood her mother differently than she ever had before. This was not the dream of a practical woman making a sensible investment. This was the dream of a woman who had needed, more than anything, to believe that there was something out there worth going toward, that the world was larger than the life she had been given. Wilhelmina drove on. The second mountain range was the Sangre de Cristos, and they were nothing like the Appalachians. Where the Appalachians were green and rounded and ancient, the Sangre de Cristos were raw and violent and magnificent, peaks that still held snow in late May, rock faces that went from tan to rust to deep red depending on the light. The kind of mountains that made you understand why someone had named them the blood of Christ. The road up and through them was barely a road, more a suggestion of passage worn by wagons that had come before, and Wilhelmina navigated it over the course of 4 days with a combination of skill, stubbornness, and the sheer refusal to believe that she had come this far only to be defeated by geology. Samuel nearly went lame on the 3rd day of the mountain pass, favoring his left front leg on the rocky descent, and Wilhelmina spent an hour examining his hoof and extracting a sharp fragment of stone that had worked itself into the soft tissue. She talked to him the whole time she was doing it, low and steady, the way her mother used to talk when she was doing something difficult. Samuel bore it with the dignity of a creature who had decided to trust her, and by the next morning he was walking sound again. She came down out of the mountains on the 5th of June, 1878, and the valley spread before her like something out of a promise. It was everything her mother's clipped advertisement had described, and nothing like what she had imagined, which is always the way with real places. The valley was wide and open, bordered on 3 sides by mountains that turned purple in the evening, threaded through its middle by a creek that ran clear and cold from the snowmelt above. The soil along the creek was rich and dark, in contrast to the drier scrubland farther from the water. There were cottonwood trees along the creek banks, their leaves catching the light like 1,000 small mirrors, and the grass in the valley floor was winter-rested but beginning to push green. The town was called Redrock, and it sat at the north end of the valley where the creek bent east, about 30 buildings in various states of solidity, a main street with a general store, a livery, a saloon, a small church that doubled as a schoolhouse, a doctor's office, a land office, and several other establishments of varying permanence. It had the look of a town that had decided to stay, but was still slightly surprised by its own commitment to the decision. Wilhelmina drove into Redrock on a Wednesday afternoon in early June, road dusty and sun-dark and vibrating, with the particular exhaustion of a journey nearly completed. She had her land papers in the inside pocket of her coat, folded small and handled so often over the past 2 months that the creases had softened into something almost like cloth. She drove first to the land office, which was a small frame building between the general store and the doctor's office, hitched Samuel and Goliath at the post out front, and walked in. The man behind the desk looked up. He was perhaps 50, with wire-rimmed spectacles and the mild, overworked expression of a territorial official who had seen everything at least twice. He looked at her road clothes, at the Winchester she carried over her arm, and composed himself into professional neutrality. "I am Wilhelmina Carver," she said. "I hold title to 40 acres in this valley, registration number 4417, originally filed in 1861 by my mother, Cecilia Carver. I have come to claim it." The land officer, whose name was Elias Ford, studied her papers carefully and cross-referenced them against his own ledgers, which took some time and involved a fair amount of muttering and the opening and closing of several drawers. But the papers were legitimate and the title was clear, and when he finally looked up again, his expression had shifted from professional neutrality to something that might have been cautious admiration. "Well, Miss Carver," he said, "the acreage is right along the lower creek. Good parcel. There's a man has been grazing cattle on the back third of it for the past 2 years, fellow named Buford Crane. You'll need to have a conversation with him about that." "I will," she said. She learned over the next 2 days that Buford Crane was a man of middling size and large self-importance who owned the largest cattle operation in the valley and had a habit of treating the unclaimed land around him as an extension of his own property. She also learned, from the woman who ran the boarding house where she took a room for $1 a night, that Crane was not a man who responded well to being told no, and particularly not by a woman. "He's tried to buy out 3 families on the south end of the valley," said the boarding house keeper, a compact and forthright woman named Agnes Delaney. "Two of them sold. The third one is still fighting it. You'll meet them eventually." Agnes set a plate of biscuits on the table with the decisive motion of someone who considered feeding people a serious matter. "Where did you travel from, if you don't mind me asking?" "Knoxville," Wilhelmina said. "Tennessee." Agnes stared at her for a long moment. "Alone? Alone?" "Lord in heaven," said Agnes, but she said it with respect rather than horror, which Wilhelmina appreciated. She met Buford Crane the following afternoon. He came to the boarding house himself, which told her that the news of her arrival and her papers had traveled quickly, as news did in small towns. He was a broad man with a red face and the manner of someone accustomed to filling up a room simply by entering it, and he stood in the doorway of the boarding house parlor with his hat on, which Wilhelmina noted as a statement of intention. "Miss Carver," he said, "I understand you're claiming the old Carver parcel." "It is not the old Carver parcel," she said. "It is the current Carver parcel. It has always been the Carver parcel. I have the papers." Crane smiled in a way that did not involve his eyes. "Now, I've been making use of that land for 2 years, and I'd be willing to compensate you fairly for the inconvenience of relocating, seeing as you just arrived and might find it easier to take a payment and go back to wherever you came from." "I came from Tennessee," Wilhelmina said. "I am not going back to Tennessee. I intend to build a house and farm on my land. Your cattle will need to be moved." The conversation did not improve from there. Crane left without overtly threatening her, but with the specific kind of politeness that was really a warning dressed in decent clothes, and Wilhelmina stood in the parlor after he was gone and felt the first genuine tremor of worry that she had allowed herself since leaving Knoxville. She had expected hard work. She had expected weather and difficult terrain and physical hardship. She had not fully accounted for the particular problem of a powerful man who had decided she was an inconvenience. Agnes appeared in the doorway with a second cup of coffee. "He won't do anything obvious," she said. "He's too careful for that, but he'll make things difficult." "Things have been difficult for 2 months," Wilhelmina said. "I have practice." She was still sitting with her coffee, working through the practical question of how and when to begin clearing her land and where to source the lumber for a house, when she heard boots on the porch steps and then a knock at the open door frame. The man in the doorway was not Buford Crane. He was perhaps 30, maybe slightly over, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of face that weather had worked on honestly, angular and tanned, and creased at the corners of his eyes from squinting at long distances. He was dressed plainly, a good shirt and worn trousers and boots that had covered considerable ground, with a hat he removed as soon as he stepped into the doorway. He was not remarkable looking in any dramatic way, not the kind of man poets bothered with, but there was something about the directness of his expression that made you pay attention. "I apologize for interrupting," he said, looking at Agnes. "I heard there was a new arrival who might be looking for some help getting established. I'm Paul Ramsey. I have a small spread about 2 miles east of the creek. I've got carpentry tools and a couple of days before my next job comes in, if the offer of help would be useful." Agnes looked at Wilhelmina. Wilhelmina looked at the man. "Wilhelmina Carver," she said. "And yes, I expect help would be useful. What is your next job, Mr. Ramsey?" He told her he did occasional contract work, carpentry and some surveying assistance, taking on work from several of the valley ranches when the need arose. He had been in the valley for 4 years, had come originally from Missouri, and knew the land and the people well. His manner was direct and unassuming, and he stated facts without embellishment, which she found immediately preferable to the various performances of helpfulness she had encountered on the road. "Buford Crane was here earlier," she said. "I expect you know him." Something moved through his expression, brief and controlled. "I know him," he said. "He's been working to expand for 3 years. He doesn't mean to lose the grazing land on your parcel without a fight." "He will not be getting it," she said. "I figured that from what Agnes described," Paul said. There was, she thought, something close to a smile at the edge of his mouth. Not condescending, not the particular smile men used when they found a woman's stubbornness charming in the way they found animals endearing. Something more like recognition. "What do you need first?" They went out to look at her land the next morning. He rode alongside her wagon on a good bay horse, and she drove Samuel and Goliath, and they went south down the valley to where the creek bent wide and shallow through a cottonwood grove. The 40 acres stretched from the creek east into a gentle slope of land that looked south and caught the light for most of the day, which was good for growing things. There were the tracks of cranes' cattle everywhere in the soft soil near the water, and the grass on the eastern slope was cropped short, but the land itself was exactly what her mother's advertisement had promised. Good creek bottom soil, a reliable water source, a southern exposure, and the mountains rising blue and constant in the distance. Wilhelmina stood at the edge of her land and breathed it in. The air smelled of creek water and sage, and something warm and mineral that she associated now with the high desert, a smell that had nothing in common with Tennessee. She stood there long enough that the silence between her and Paul Ramsey grew substantial, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. He seemed to understand that she needed a moment without anyone speaking, and he gave it to her. When she finally turned, she found him not watching her, as she might have expected, but looking at the land itself, reading it with the practical eye of someone who knew ground and what it could do. "The house should sit up the slope from the creek," he said. "Far enough from the flood line to be safe in a wet year, but close enough to the water that hauling won't be miserable. That shelf of ground there, where the slope levels before it rises again, that's the natural building site." She had been thinking the same thing. How long to put up a simple structure, one room to start? "With good lumber and 2 people working, a week to 10 days. I know where to source decent lumber without paying Crane's prices. He owns the main mill supply route, but there's a sawyer in the next valley who sells to anyone willing to haul the wood." They spent that morning walking the boundary of the parcel together, and he told her what he knew of the soil and the water and the growing season, which was shorter than Tennessee but not impossibly so, and she told him what she planned to grow. Kitchen garden, some wheat, corn if the growing season permitted, and eventually an orchard if she could get apple and pear trees established. He listened to all of it with genuine attention. Not the polite listening of a man waiting for his turn to redirect the conversation, but actual sustained attention. And at one point he asked a follow-up question about something she had said about crop rotation that told her he had been listening closely enough to understand what she was actually saying. They stopped at the creek to let the horse drink, and Paul pulled 2 biscuits from his saddlebag and offered her one without ceremony, and they stood in the shade of the cottonwoods eating biscuits and looking at the creek, and he said, "What made you come all this way alone, if you don't mind me asking?" She told him about her mother. Not everything, not the whole weight of it, but the essentials. Cecilia Carver's dream, the land bought and never claimed, the note her mother had left her, the 6 years of carrying it. She told it plainly, without sentiment, because she had not yet decided how much of herself to make available to this man or to anyone in this town. When she finished, Paul was quiet for a moment. He looked at the creek and then he said, "Your mother sounds like she had remarkable courage." "She did," Wilhelmina said. "What about you?" he said, and then more specifically, more carefully, "What do you want for yourself here?" Not what she wanted. "What do you want?" Wilhelmina went very still. In all the time she had been planning this journey, talking about it with people in Knoxville and along the road, explaining her reasons, defending her choices, she had never once been asked that question. Not by her aunts, who had asked why she would throw away everything she had built. Not by the man from the land office. Not by Agnes. Not by any of the people who had offered advice or warnings or assistance along the way. Everyone had understood her mission in terms of her mother's dream, and she had presented it that way because it was the simplest explanation. But the truth was more complicated than that. She looked at this man she had met the day before, standing in the shade of cottonwood trees on the land her mother had bought 17 years ago, and she said something she had not said to anyone. I want to be somewhere that I built myself, she said. Not somewhere I was placed. I want to look at a field and know that every furrow in it came from my own hands. I want to be too tired at the end of the day to wonder whether I am living the right life, because the living of it will be self-evident. She paused. I want a home that is mine in the way that a thing is yours when you have made it, not just owned it. Paul Ramsey nodded slowly. He did not say that was a fine thing, or that her mother would be proud, or any of the other reasonable responses that would have made the moment smaller than it was. He just nodded, as if what she had said was exactly as important as it was, and said, "Then we had better get your house built." The next 10 days were among the hardest and most satisfying of Wilhelmina's life. They hauled lumber from the sawyer in the next valley, 3 trips in the wagon with Paul on horseback alongside, and the sawyer, a man named Horace Birch, gave her a fair price and helped load the boards himself. The lumber smelled clean and new, yellow pine that went golden in the afternoon light, and she stacked it carefully on the shelf of ground. Paul had identified and covered it with her oilcloth while they prepared the foundation. Paul knew what he was doing with a hammer and a saw, and he worked without waste of motion or time, but he was equally willing to teach as he worked, and she did not allow herself to be a spectator. She learned to true a joint and to notch a beam and to measure twice before cutting, and her hands, already hardened from the road, developed a new set of calluses. They worked from first light to last light and ate simple meals by the campfire she had set up near the wagon, and in the evenings Paul would sometimes stay and drink coffee and they would talk. He was not a man of many words, but the words he had were chosen carefully, and she found that she could say things to him that she would not have said to someone who spoke more and listened less. She told him about the crossing of the mountains, about Samuel's stone in his hoof, about the farm family in North Carolina. He told her about coming west from Missouri 4 years ago, about a failed attempt at cattle ranching that had cleaned out his savings, but left him with skills and knowledge of the territory. He did not tell her why he had left Missouri, and she did not ask, understanding that some things had their own time. On the 5th day of building, Buford Crane rode out with 2 of his men and stood at the edge of the parcel watching them work for a long time without speaking. The presence of the 3 men on horseback at the edge of her property was clearly intended to make her feel the weight of opposition, and she responded to it by continuing to nail boards at exactly the pace she had been maintaining and not looking up. Paul had looked up briefly, assessed the situation, and returned to work. After a while, Crane and his men rode away. "He's counting on you to feel alone out here," Paul said quietly, without stopping his work. "I am alone out here," she said. "Not entirely," he said, and drove another nail and did not elaborate, but the statement settled somewhere warm in her chest and stayed there. On the evening of the 8th day, they raised the walls, and on the 10th day, the house had a roof. It was 1 room, functional and honest, with a good fireplace that Paul had built from the Flat Creek stones he had loaded into the wagon on their lumber runs, and a door that faced south to catch the morning light, and 2 windows with wooden shutters against the wind. It was not large and it was not beautiful in any ornamental way, but it was solid and it was hers, and when she stood inside it for the first time with the last of the evening light coming through the south window and laying itself gold across the pine floor, she stood with her hand pressed flat against the wall and felt something so enormous move through her that she had to look at the ceiling to keep from crying. Paul was outside loading his tools into his saddlebags, and she composed herself and went out and said, "Mr. Ramsey, I am in your debt." He shook his head. "You worked as hard as I did." "That is true," she said. "But you knew what you were doing at the start and I did not, and the difference matters." He was quiet for a moment, tying off the saddlebag, and then he looked at her directly and said, "May I come back on Sunday? There are things I'd like to show you about the south-facing slope that would help with your planting." "Yes," she said. "Come for supper." It was not the beginning of a courtship, not exactly, not yet, but it was the beginning of something, a thread that had been thrown between them in the shadow of the cottonwood trees and had not been cut since. She knew it and he knew it, and both of them were, for their own reasons, careful with it. She spent the rest of that week establishing herself in earnest. She planted a kitchen garden in the rich creek-bottom soil, working the ground with the determination of someone who had been wanting to put her hands in the earth for 20 years. She fenced a small corral for Samuel and Goliath, using posts she had cut herself from the cottonwood deadfall along the creek bank, and she turned them out into the valley grass each morning and brought them in at evening. She introduced herself to the family on the south end of the valley who was holding out against Crane's pressure. A husband and wife named Marco and Elena Vasquez, who had built their small ranch 8 years ago and had no intention of leaving it, and who received Wilhelmina with a warmth and solidity that made her feel, for the first time since arriving, that she was becoming part of a community and not merely a newcomer in one. Elena Vasquez was a practical and energetic woman who could do more things simultaneously than any person Wilhelmina had ever met, and Marco was a cattleman who knew the valley's politics and terrain with the precision of a man who had needed to know them for survival. They had 3 children and a 4th on the way, and their ranch was orderly and alive with the specific kind of productivity that came from 2 people working the same direction for a long time. Wilhelmina liked them both enormously on first meeting, and liked them more with every meeting after. "Crane will send someone to your fence line eventually," Marco told her, standing in his yard while Elena brought lemonade she had made from some miraculous supply of preserved lemons. "He's done it to us twice. The key is to document everything and take it to Elias Ford at the land office before Crane can get his version on record first." "And Paul Ramsey," Elena said. "He has been a good neighbor to us. He knows the county surveyor and has used those connections to help us twice already. He is a man of his word." Wilhelmina took note of this assessment and said nothing particular in response, because Elena Vasquez had very bright eyes and Wilhelmina suspected she had already formed her own ideas about the situation. Paul came on Sunday as he had said he would, and she cooked a proper supper for the first time on the new fireplace, which required some negotiation with the draft before it cooperated, and they ate at the simple table she had built from leftover lumber boards. He showed her, as promised, the aspects of the south slope that would affect her planting, the way the drainage ran and where the late frost pockets were, and how the prevailing winds came down from the northwest, so that any windbreak she planted needed to account for that direction. He had the knowledge of someone who had paid close attention to a place for a long time, and she received it the way she received all useful information, with gratitude and the intention to apply it well. After supper they sat outside on the low step she had built across the south door, because the evening was warm and the fireflies were beginning to appear in the grass along the creek, and they watched the stars come out over the mountains. The sky at night in the New Mexico territory was something that kept astonishing her, darker than any sky she had known in Tennessee, more stars than seemed plausible, the Milky Way so clear and dense that it looked like smoke. "How did you end up a carpenter and surveyor's assistant?" she asked. "You mentioned the cattle operation didn't work out." He looked at the stars for a moment before answering. "I came west thinking I knew what I wanted," he said. "Turned out what I thought I wanted was mostly what I was expected to want. A ranch, a cattle operation, the whole story." He paused. "After it failed, I spent a year just working for other people, learning what I was actually good at. Turned out I was good at building things and reading land, so that's what I do." "Do you miss Missouri?" "Not especially," he said. "My family is there, but we are not." He searched for the right phrase. "We are not well matched in our thinking. They have very clear ideas about the way a life should look, and I seem to keep building lives that look different than the picture." She understood this with a directness that went straight to the center of her. "Yes," she said quietly, "I know what that is like." He turned and looked at her then, and in the starlight his expression was open in a way she had not seen from him in daylight, less guarded, more present, and she held the eye contact for a beat longer than was strictly neutral before she looked back at the stars. "What was your mother like?" he asked. "Not the story of the land, I mean. What was she like as a person?" No one had asked her that in a very long time. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, letting the actual living memory of Cecilia Carver come forward rather than the version she carried in the story she told. She sang while she sewed, Wilhelmina said. Hymns mostly, but sometimes songs that were not hymns and that she'd stop singing if she noticed I was listening, as if I might be corrupted by them. She smiled at the dark. She had very strong opinions about bread and none whatsoever about politics, which was the inverse of what you'd expect from a woman who made the decisions she made. She was not demonstrative. She did not use many words to describe her feelings. But she would come into my room when I was a child and sit on the edge of my bed for a few minutes before sleep, and she would smooth my hair back from my face without saying anything. And that was the thing that told me everything I needed to know about whether I was loved. Paul said nothing, but she was aware of his attention, full and quiet beside her. She would have loved this sky, Wilhelmina said. Tell me something about what you want, he said, and there was an echo in it of the question he had asked at the creek, but it was different this time, more specific, and she felt it differently. Not the farm, for yourself. She thought about that for a long time, longer than she usually permitted herself. I want to be known, she said finally. Not my usefulness or my competence, both of which I am aware of and can speak to myself. I mean known as in. She struggled for it. As in the way you know a landscape you have stood in long enough to see what it looks like in every season, not just the surface of it. He did not say anything for a moment, and then he said, quietly and without any performance around it, I think I understand that. She believed that he did. The weeks that followed had the quality of something being built very carefully, with attention to the grain of the wood and the level of the ground, nothing rushed and nothing forced. Paul came to her land 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes with purpose and sometimes not, and she was honest enough with herself to know that both of them found reasons to extend the time, that the conversations ran long past the practical and into the territory of preference and history and thought. They argued once about whether Lincoln's Reconstruction policies had done what they were intended to do, and the argument was lively and honest, and did not damage anything between them, which she took as a good sign. They discovered a shared interest in mathematics, of all things, and spent an improbable hour one afternoon working through a geometry problem related to laying out the second building she was planning, a storage shed and future barn, and the working of it was genuinely pleasurable for both of them in a way that made her laugh at herself afterward. She was building her farm with the same discipline she had applied to the journey. She planted wheat in the eastern acres above the flood line, and corn in the richer creek-bottom soil, and a kitchen garden beside the house that was already producing radishes and lettuce, and the first of what she hoped would be a serious operation in herbs for both cooking and medicine. She learned from Elena Vasquez about the specific challenges of the high desert growing season, the late frosts that could come in May and the early ones in September, and she planned accordingly. She was happy. Not the absent, distracted happiness of a person enduring something tolerable, but the present, effortful happiness of a person engaged entirely with what they are doing. Crane made his move in late July. She came out one morning to find her south fence line cut, 3 posts pulled from the ground and her wire rolled back, and 4 of Crane's cattle grazing in her corn field. The damage to the corn was significant, perhaps a quarter of the planting, and her initial response was a cold and thorough fury that she stood in for several minutes before she allowed it to clarify into action. She went first to Elia's Ford at the land office, as Marco had advised, and she reported the trespass formally and in detail, with the dates and her description of the damage, and Ford wrote it down with the careful neutrality of a man who was watching to see how things would go. She then went to find Paul, who came back with her to inspect the damage and spoke to Elia's Ford himself about what he had observed, adding the specific legal language about property boundaries and trespass that carried more weight in an official report. Then she went to find Buford Crane. She found him at his main ranch house, 2 miles north of town, and she rode out there on Goliath, who was more comfortable to ride than Samuel and had a better temperament under pressure. Crane came out of his house when he saw her coming and stood on his porch with 2 ranch hands nearby, and his expression as she dismounted and walked toward him was one of calculated patience. "Mr. Crane," she said, "your cattle have been in my corn. The fence was cut, not broken, which means this was not an accident. I have reported the trespass to the land office. I'm here to tell you directly that if there is a second incident, I will pursue this through the territorial court, and I have enough documentation and enough witnesses to make that an expensive inconvenience for you." Crane regarded her from the porch. "Miss Carver, you are a long way from home." "This is my home," she said. "I am exactly where I am supposed to be." The ranch hands exchanged a look. Crane studied her for a long moment, working through his calculation, and she stood straight and steady and let him work through it. She was not as frightened as she might have been, and she thought this was partly because she had spent 2 months on the road alone being resourceful, and partly because she was aware that in the 4 years Paul Ramsey had been in this valley, he had built connections and relationships and standing that made her less isolated than Crane perhaps assumed. Crane said finally, "I'll have my men repair the fence." It was not an apology and not an admission, and they both understood that, but it was a retreat, and a retreat was what she needed for now. She rode back to her farm and found Paul waiting at the gate, having come from town after speaking to Ford, and when she told him what had happened his expression moved through concern to relief to something that he kept quickly neutral. "You went out there alone," he said. "Yes," she said. "It was my property and my problem to address." "I know," he said. "I only wish I had been there, not because you needed me to be," he added with precision, "but because I would have liked to see that." She looked at him. He looked at her. The evening light was coming down through the cottonwoods in long ropes of gold, and the creek was running its quiet conversation with the stones, and something that had been building between them for 2 months resolved itself very quietly in that moment, like a piece of a puzzle that settles into place, and suddenly the whole picture is clear. She stepped forward and kissed him. It was not a tentative kiss, because Wilhelmina Carver did not do anything tentatively when she had decided to do it. It was direct and genuine, and it lasted long enough to be unambiguous, and when she stepped back he was looking at her with an expression that was open and startled and warm and something deeper under all of that, something that had the quality of recognition. "Well," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been wanting to do that for approximately 6 weeks," he said. "I know," she said. "So have I. I was determining whether it was a good idea. And, evidently, I think it is." He put his hand against her face very gently, with the tenderness of a man who knew how to be careful with things that mattered, and she leaned into it for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling the warmth of his palm, the realness of this man and this place and this day. Then she stepped back and said, practically, "I need to go look at the corn damage and estimate what I'll need to replant." He laughed. She had not heard him laugh fully before, and it was a good sound, easy and genuine, coming from somewhere unguarded. "All right," he said. "I'll come with you." August in the valley was warm and full of work and full of Paul. He did not move onto her land or suggest anything premature, and she did not ask or expect it, because they were both people who moved at the pace of things that were meant to last. But he was present, 2 or 3 times a week becoming 4 or 5, and the time they spent together was as various and easy as the time between people who are genuinely discovering each other. They worked side by side on the farm, and they talked in the evenings, and they read to each other sometimes from the books she had brought in the wagon, and sometimes they simply sat in the comfortable silence that only exists between people who have decided to be honest with each other. He told her about Missouri. Not all of it at once, but in pieces, as trust is built in pieces when it is built well. His family had expected him to stay and work the family farm, the same farm his grandfather had started, and when he had said he needed to go west and find his own ground, they had not understood it and had taken the not understanding personally. He had a brother who spoke to him still, and a mother who wrote letters that were warm but contained between their lines the persistent question of when he would come back to be the person they recognized. He loved them, and the distance between his life and their expectations of it was a sadness he carried without drama. "Do you think you will ever go back?" she asked. "To visit, maybe," he said. "Not to stay. This is where I belong now." She understood the statement to include her, and she received it quietly and held it carefully. She asked him once on a warm August evening when they were sitting on her south step watching heat lightning far off over the mountains whether he had ever been close to marrying. He was quiet for a long moment. "There was a woman in Missouri," he said. "Before I left, we were spoken of together for 2 years. But when I told her I was going west, she cried and asked me to stay, and I understood then that she needed a man who could be still in a way that I couldn't. It would not have been right for either of us." "Did you love her?" "I was fond of her," he said honestly. "I think I was more in love with the idea of having a life settled enough to include a wife. Does that make sense?" "Yes," she said. "Entirely." "What about you?" he said. She told him about the 2 courtships in Knoxville with the same brevity and honesty with which he had told her about Missouri, and she described the specific way those men had required her to be smaller than she was, not cruelly, not deliberately, but simply by not knowing what to do with her actual size. Paul listened, and did not say the expected thing, which would have been to reassure her that those men had been wrong to want her to be smaller. Instead he said, "Do you think it's possible to love someone who doesn't want to know all of you?" She looked at him. "No," she said, "I don't." "Neither do I," he said. The lightning moved closer and the first smell of rain came down from the mountains, the specific clean electric smell of a summer storm, and she tilted her head back to feel the first drops and heard him say, very quietly, "I think I love you, Wilhelmina." She kept her head tilted back for a moment. The rain was beginning in earnest, warm and steady, and the lightning was closer now, its light washing the mountains in brief silver. She said, "I know you do. I love you too." He took her hand. They stayed on the step while the storm came in and the rain fell through the cottonwoods and the creek rose a few inches in its banks, and the mountains were lost in cloud. And they sat together in the rain without moving, her hand in his, because neither of them wanted to go inside yet and neither of them needed to. In September, Paul proposed. He did it in the most characteristic way possible, which was to say he did it directly and without excessive ceremony, sitting across from her at the table where they had eaten supper together so many times by now. He said he had been thinking about it for some time, and that he did not want to rush her but that he wanted her to know where he stood, and that he wanted to build a life on this land with her, not merely help her build hers, but actually share it, and that he understood if she needed more time to be certain. She looked at him across the table in the amber light of the oil lamp, this man who asked her what she wanted, who listened when she answered, who had never once suggested she needed to be less in order to fit beside him, and she said, "Yes, not because I need you to manage my life, because I want you in it." "I know the difference," he said. "That's exactly why I asked." They were married in October, in the small church that doubled as the schoolhouse, with Agnes Delaney as a witness and Marco and Elena Vasquez standing alongside with their children in their best clothes, and the Valley congregation filling the pews. Agnes had organized a proper celebration after, with a table full of food contributed by every family in the Valley, including some she had not yet formally met, and Redrock turned out in the way that small western towns turned out for things that mattered, with warmth and food and noise, and the specific joy of a community that was glad to have something good to celebrate. Elias Ford was there, slightly unbuttoned in a way she had never seen from him, and he shook her hand with what appeared to be genuine emotion, and told her that he had known when she had walked into his office in June with her papers that she was going to change the particular balance of this valley, and he was glad of it. She did not fully understand what he meant, but she thanked him. Buford Crane was not there. His absence was noted and not mourned. Paul moved his few things from his small spread east of the creek, which he sold to a young couple who had arrived in the valley in August with a baby and a wagon full of hope, and he brought his tools and his horse and his books and a fine iron stove that she had not had, and that transformed the single room of her house in a way that was almost luxurious. They began immediately planning the expansion of the house, a second room to the east, and eventually a front porch that would face south and catch the morning light. The winter of 1878 to 1879 was their first winter together, and it was cold and long and mostly wonderful. They worked on the house expansion in the warmer parts of winter and read by the stove in the cold parts and cooked together, which turned out to be a particular pleasure, because Paul was surprisingly good at bread, and she was surprisingly good at soups and stews, and between them they ate very well. She continued her planning for the spring planting season, which now included a larger wheat field and a serious attempt at fruit trees, and he drew up the surveying for an irrigation channel from the creek that would make the eastern acres more productive in dry years. The conflict with Buford Crane did not end, but it changed in character. With her and Paul together, with their connections to the Vasquez family and the wider valley community, with the formal record at the land office and Paul's relationship with the county surveyor, Crane found that the simple tactics of intimidation and fencing interference were not producing results. He tried twice more through the winter to create pressure, once by blocking the road that ran along the north edge of her property, with a claim that it crossed his land, a claim that Paul's surveying work efficiently disproved and that Elia's Ford dismissed. The second time Crane sent men to cut a different section of her fence line, but by now the valley community was watching, and there were 3 witnesses to it who went directly to the land office, and the formal complaint against Crane went to the county level and cost him a fine and considerable standing with the territorial land authority. By spring, Crane appeared to have made the calculation that pursuing this particular conflict was more expensive than it was worth, and he redirected his attentions northward, toward a different parcel being contested by a newcomer who did not have Wilhelmina's resources of stubbornness and community. Wilhelmina noted this with a complex mix of relief and anger at the injustice of it, that he would simply move his tactics to a less defended target, and she made sure to go and introduce herself to the newcomer and tell him exactly what she had learned and how to use it. The spring of 1879 came in warm, and she planted the expanded wheat field and the corn, and established the fruit tree nursery on the south slope. Young apple and pear trees set in their rows with the care of a woman planting something she expected to tend for decades. She planted in the morning, and in the afternoon she worked alongside Paul on the irrigation channel, which was hard physical labor and which produced, when it was finished, and the first water ran through it to the eastern acres, a satisfaction so complete that she stood at the headgate and laughed out loud. She discovered she was expecting a child in early May of 1879. She told Paul in the evening, matter-of-factly, sitting at the table with the windows open and the smell of spring coming in, and his response was to go very still for a moment, and then to look at her with an expression of such uncomplicated joy that she felt it move through her like warmth. "Are you well?" He asked immediately, practically because he was Paul. "I am very well," she said. He came around the table and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands and held them, and he said, "We will have to finish the second room before December." "That was my first thought too," she said. He pressed his lips to her hands once and gently, and then straightened and said, "We should invite the Vasquezes for supper this week." "Yes," she said, smiling. "We should." Elena Vasquez, who was the most practically joyful person Wilhelmina had ever known, wept a little when she heard, and then immediately began telling her everything she needed to know about preparing for a birth in a frontier home, which was considerable. And she sent Marco to find Paul, and the 2 men went outside and stood in the yard talking in the way men talked about these things, with the slightly dazed quality of people in the presence of something larger than ordinary life. The summer of 1879 was busy and golden and full. The wheat came in well, and they harvested it together with help from 3 neighboring families, working from sunrise to sunset in the August heat, and the barn they were beginning to build at the edge of the upper field rose steadily. Her kitchen garden was so productive that she was supplying Agnes's boarding house and the general store with surplus vegetables, and the income from this, small but real, went into the fund she was building toward purchasing 2 milk cows in the fall. She was large with the pregnancy by August, and she adjusted what she could do accordingly, not because Paul asked her to, but because she was a practical woman who understood her body, and she worked from the wagon and from a seat in the shade for the heavy harvest days while directing things with an authority that made Marco Vasquez mutter admiringly to Paul that she would have been an excellent general. The second room was completed in September, just as Paul had promised, and they furnished it simply and well, a proper bed and a wardrobe, and along the south wall, the small oak cradle that Paul had built himself over the long winter evenings, sanding it smooth until it was soft as old leather. Their son arrived on the 22nd of November, 1879, in the middle of a November night with snow on the mountains, and the stove burning high, and Elena Vasquez present and competent, and Paul somewhere between the bedroom door and the outside step, doing what fathers did in that era, which was to be simultaneously desperately concerned and constitutionally incapable of helping. The birth was hard and long and eventually uncomplicated, and when Wilhelmina held her son for the first time in the gray dawn light coming through the window, she felt something so enormous and specific and knew that she had no name for it, only the recognition that she had been changed in a way that would last. Paul came in, finally, when Elena called him, and he stood in the doorway looking at his wife and his son with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, exposed and luminous and unguarded in the specific way of a person seeing something they had not known they were capable of wanting. "Come here," she said. He came and sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms and he held his son with the careful intensity of a man who had spent 4 years learning to do things right, and the baby looked up at him with the unfocused ancient wisdom of a newborn, and Paul said, "Hello," very quietly, as if introductions were called for. "What shall we name him?" she asked. They had discussed names without settling on one, because both of them believed in waiting to see a face. She looked at her son and saw something in him that was both familiar and entirely new, a combination of Paul's dark hair and her own strong jaw, and something entirely his own. "Cecilia was your mother," Paul said, still looking at the baby. "What was your father's name?" "Robert," she said. "His name was Robert Ramsey Carver," she said. "If you don't mind the Carver." He looked up at her. "I don't mind anything about Carver," he said. And she laughed, genuinely, even as tired as she was. And Elena Vasquez, who was tidying things at the foot of the bed with the efficiency of a woman who had been present at several births including her own children's, made a sound that was distinctly pleased and pretended not to have heard. The years that followed were full and hard and good in the way that lives are when they have been built by people who know what they are building and why. Robert grew from a winter baby into a strong-legged, bright-eyed child who had his father's deliberate nature and his mother's stubbornness in approximately equal measure, which made for an interesting combination, and a child who was both reasoned and immovable about the things he had decided, and who had to be argued with logically because tantrums got him nowhere with either parent. He followed Paul everywhere on the farm from the time he could walk, carrying small things in imitation of whatever Paul was carrying, and he sat in Wilhelmina's lap in the evenings while she read to him from her teaching books, which she had eventually put to formal use as the schoolteacher for Redrock's one-room schoolhouse, a position she had taken on when the Valley's previous teacher had left in 1880. Teaching was something she had done before and set aside, but teaching children in a frontier school whose future depended directly on what they learned was different from teaching in Knoxville, and she found herself invested in it in a way that surprised her. She taught 32 children ranging from 6 to 15 years old, in a room that she had furnished with her own money from the surplus garden income when the county contribution proved insufficient, and she taught them reading and arithmetic and some history and geography. And when she taught them history, she told it as accurately as she knew how, including the parts that were uncomfortable, because she believed that the truth about how a country had built itself, the dispossession and the injustice, alongside the courage and the invention, was something these children needed to understand if they were going to build anything better. She had a conversation once with the territorial school inspector, a man from Santa Fe who came through Redrock in 1881 and reviewed her classroom, and he expressed some polite concern about the breadth of her curriculum relative to the standard. She explained her thinking to him directly, as was her way, and he departed without either approving or objecting, which she took as sufficient. Paul's work had evolved. He had taken on more surveying contracts as the territory grew and new families arrived, and the need for accurate land records became more pressing. He was fair and meticulous in his work, and his reputation was such that by 1882 he had more contracts than he could manage alone, and he brought on a young assistant, a 20-year-old named Thomas Quan, who had come west from California, and who had a gift for numbers and maps that Paul recognized and developed over 2 years of teaching. Thomas eventually set up his own surveying practice in a neighboring town, and Paul was quietly proud of this in the way of someone who understood that teaching well meant making yourself unnecessary. They had a second child in 1882, a daughter they named Cecilia, after her mother's mother. Cecilia was born in the spring, which meant the house was warm and the world was green, and she arrived in the morning, which Wilhelmina took as characteristic. Where Robert had come in the dark and the cold with the snow on the mountains, Cecilia came with the light, a morning child who seemed to have arrived with her eyes already trying to focus on everything at once. The farm had grown considerably by then. The original 40 acres of wheat and corn and kitchen garden had been supplemented by the fruit orchard, which was now producing its first real harvest, and a modest dairy operation with the 2 milk cows she had bought in 1879 and 2 more purchased since. She sold cream and butter to the boarding house and the hotel that had opened in Redrock in 1880, and the orchard apples went to the general store and to families throughout the valley. The farm was not making them rich, but it was making them self-sustaining, and then some, and each year's harvest built a small surplus that went into the strongbox under the floorboard in the bedroom. Buford Crane's power in the valley diminished steadily through the early 1880s as more families settled, and the community grew, and the county's legal structures became more robust and harder to navigate around. He sold his operation in pieces by 1883, rumored to have overextended himself financially on a cattle speculation that went wrong, and moved south toward Arizona. Wilhelmina did not celebrate his departure publicly, but she did allow herself a single glass of apple brandy, which she had made herself from the first real apple harvest, and she toasted her fence line. The valley was different now than it had been in June of 1878, when she had driven down from the mountains in her wagon. Redrock had 40 buildings instead of 30, a proper hotel and a second dry goods store, and a small newspaper that had been established in 1880 by a man named Samuel Park, who had opinions about everything and the printing press to express them. There was a proper doctor now, a young woman from Ohio named Dr. Grace Holt, who had arrived in 1882, and whose presence in the valley was met with the same mixture of surprise and eventual appreciation that Wilhelmina's own arrival had met, and who had become a friend and neighbor over the years. Marco and Elena Vasquez had expanded their operation and had their 4th child, and they remained the family that Wilhelmina felt closest to in the valley, the people she had known from the beginning and who had known her, who were present at both the ordinary days and the important ones. Their oldest daughter and Robert were inseparable friends from childhood, which Wilhelmina observed with amusement and declined to comment on, because they were both children and the future was the future, and would arrange itself as it pleased. Agnes Delaney still ran the boarding house and still fed people with the decisive generosity that was her most characteristic quality, and she had become, over the years, the kind of friend that women are lucky to find once in a life, blunt and loyal and genuinely interested, and without any interest in pretending that things were other than they were. It was Agnes who said to Wilhelmina one afternoon in the fall of 1883, sitting in the boarding house kitchen over coffee, while Robert and Cecilia played in the yard under Paul's intermittent supervision, "You know, when you came into this town 5 years ago, covered in road dust and carrying that rifle, Elias Ford came directly to me and said he had just met a woman who was going to change the character of this place." Wilhelmina looked at her. "Elias Ford said that." "He did. He has more poetry in him than he shows." Agnes poured more coffee. "Was he right?" Wilhelmina thought about it honestly. "I don't know that I changed it," she said. "I think I fit into it." The community was already here, already building. The Vasquezes, you, Paul, all the families. I was one more person adding to it. "You were the person who stood up to Crane when 3 other people had not," Agnes said, "and taught 30 children history they would not have been taught otherwise, and started the fruit orchard that is now the best source of apples in 2 counties, and convinced Dr. Holt to stay when she was considering going back east after her first year. You were all those things. Don't minimize them." Wilhelmina was quiet for a moment. "My mother would have loved this valley," she said. It was not the first time she had said it, but it was never less true for the repetition. "Tell me more about her," Agnes said. She had asked before over the years in the way that good friends circle back to the important things. And Wilhelmina told her again, a little differently each time, because memory was like that. It shifted and deepened with the years. And what she saw when she looked back at Cecilia Carver now was not only the woman who had saved for a piece of land in the territory, but the woman who had sung hymns while she sewed and had come into her daughter's room at night to smooth the hair back from her face. The woman who had held a dream of open land and clean water and something built by her own hands, and had held it so tightly that when she died it had passed directly into her daughter like something live and necessary. The dream had made it here. It had crossed 2 mountain ranges, the Appalachians and the Sangre de Cristos, in a wagon driven by a stubborn woman with a Winchester rifle and 2 mules named Samuel and Goliath, and it had taken root in the valley like the apple trees on the south slope, slowly and then with increasing certainty, until it was simply part of the landscape and hard to imagine the landscape without it. That evening, Wilhelmina walked out to the south slope in the late afternoon light, the October light that made everything gold and specific. The apple trees were bare now, their fruit long since harvested, their branches dark against the sky, but she could see in the architecture of them, in the set of their roots and the spread of their limbs, the evidence of years of growth. She had planted these trees as saplings in the spring of 1879, and they were established now, mature trees with a decade of growing ahead of them at least, and they would be producing fruit long after she was gone. She heard Paul coming up the slope behind her, his familiar footsteps on the dry grass, and he came and stood beside her, and they looked at the orchard together in the same silence they had been sharing for 5 years, the comfortable silence of people who no longer needed language to be together. "Robert wants to know if he can help with the pruning this winter," Paul said. "He is 8 years old," she said. "He is a very serious 8-year-old. "He is," she agreed. "Yes, he can help." Paul put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, into the warmth of him, the solid presence of him. The mountains to the west were going red with the sunset, living up to their name. "I was thinking," Paul said, "that we might want to start a second orchard on the north end of the property. Pears do well in the slightly cooler ground up there." She considered it. "We would need to bring water from the channel and extension. I can survey it next week, see what's practical." "All right," she said. "Pears." He pressed a kiss to the side of her head, just above her temple, the way he did, and she felt it the way she always did, the simple dailiness of it that was also always everything. "Paul," she said. "Yes, I am happy." He was quiet for a moment, and she knew without looking that his expression was the open, unguarded one that she had first seen in the starlight on her south step, and that she had been seeing ever since, that expression he had for moments of real feeling that he did not try to manage. "I know," he said. "So am I." They stood together on the south slope, while the light went from gold to copper to the deep blue of early evening, and the stars began to appear above the mountains one by one. And below them, the lights of the farmhouse came on, visible through the trees. The warm rectangle of the window where Cecilia would be sitting with her picture book and Robert would be doing something complicated with sticks and rocks that he called construction, and that Paul took perfectly seriously as an engineering project. And the stove would be warming the kitchen, and the smell of the soup she had left would be filling the rooms. This was what her mother had dreamed of, this land and this house and this life. But it was also what Wilhelmina had built herself, the particular specific life that was hers, made by her hands and her choices, and the stubbornness that everyone had always found excessive, and that had turned out to be exactly sufficient. Made alongside a man who had asked her, in the shade of cottonwood trees on her first day on her land, what she wanted for herself, and who had been asking her ever since, and listening to the answers. She had carried her mother's dream across 2 mountain ranges, and she had arrived, finally, here. And here turned out to be everything the dream had promised, and also something the dream had not accounted for, something that was entirely and only hers, a life that fit her exactly, in all her dimensions, in a valley that had learned to hold her, with a man beside her who had never once asked her to be smaller. Spring came to the valley in 1884 with the kind of decisive warmth that made everything look new, even the things that were years old and fully established. Robert ran through the orchard checking the trees for blossom, with the focused energy of a child who had been promised a responsibility and intended to honor it. Cecilia, who had recently decided that she would be a doctor when she grew up on the basis of 3 visits to Dr. Grace Holt's office, spent her mornings cataloging the plants in the kitchen garden, with a seriousness that made both her parents exchange a look of quiet shared pride. Paul was surveying a new property for a family arriving from Colorado, working the north end of the valley where the creek widened before the mountains rose. He had earned, over 6 years, a reputation that went beyond Redrock, and he had turned down twice now the offer of a contract position with the territorial government in Santa Fe because it would have required them to leave, and leaving had never been a serious option. This was where they were. Wilhelmina was teaching the spring term to 37 children now, which was more than she had started with, and she had argued successfully with the county for a proper classroom addition to the schoolhouse building, which was underway. She was also expecting their 3rd child, which she had known for 2 months, and which she and Paul had not yet told anyone except Elena Vasquez, who was impossible to keep anything from for more than 6 weeks. She was, on a May morning in 1884, standing in the kitchen doorway with her coffee, looking out at the south slope where the apple blossoms were open and the bees were working through them with their ancient concentration, when Paul came in from the early chores and stood behind her and looked over her shoulder at the same thing. "It's a good blossom year," he said. "The best since we planted them," she said. "The pear trees are behind, but they'll catch up." She leaned back against him. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, his hands over hers on the coffee cup, and they stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the orchard in the morning light. "Paul," she said. "Yes." She turned around to face him, which meant stepping back slightly in the doorway, and looked at him. After 6 years, she knew his face the way she knew the valley, in every light and season, the specific cast of his eyes when he was thinking hard, and the particular set of his jaw when he was trying not to show that he was worried about something, and the way the lines at the corners of his eyes deepened when something genuinely delighted him. "I wanted to say something to you," she said, "that I have been meaning to say for a while." "Then say it," he said, which was his way, direct and unhurried. "When I came to this valley," she said, "I came carrying something that had been given to me. My mother's dream, her love of this place she had never seen, and I intended to honor it, and I have, and I am glad of it. But I want you to know that the life I have here, the whole of it, is also mine. I built it. We built it. And I am not carrying it for anyone else." She paused. "I am living it for myself." He looked at her for a long moment with that open, luminous expression. "I know," he said. "I have known that since the day I first asked you." "I know you have," she said, "but I wanted to say it plainly for myself, so that it was said." He kissed her in the kitchen doorway, with the blossom smell coming in on the morning air and the bees in the orchard and the children beginning to stir in the next room and the coffee cooling in the cup and the whole of their life arranged around them, substantial and real and made by their own hands. When he pulled back he said, "I love you, Wilhelmina Carver." "Ramsey," she said, "Wilhelmina Carver Ramsey." "Both," he said, "always both," she smiled. "Yes," she said, "always both." Their third child arrived in late November 1884, another boy, whom they named James Henry Ramsey. James for no particular reason, except that it suited him from the first moment, and Henry for Paul's brother in Missouri who had kept writing, and kept the relationship alive across the distance, and who received the news of his nephew with a letter of such warmth that Paul read it twice, and folded it carefully into the strong-box with the important papers. James was an easier baby than Robert had been and more various than Cecilia, content to watch the world with dark eyes that took everything in, and he grew into a child who talked constantly and was interested in everything, and who could be distracted from a tantrum by the introduction of any new fact about any subject, a quality that made Wilhelmina suspect he would either be a teacher or a journalist or possibly both. The valley in the late 1880s was a different valley than the one she had driven into in the spring of 1878. It was fuller and more complex, with more families and more businesses and the specific social texture of a community that had been built by people with varied histories and was learning to hold all of them. There were frictions and disagreements, and the occasional dispute that required the land office or the county court. But there was also the deep and accumulated generosity of a community that remembered what it had taken to get there, and that knowledge tended, on most days, to outweigh the friction. Wilhelmina sat on the board of the school now, and had won the argument for a second teacher in 1887, so that the older students could be properly taught. She had also helped establish a small lending library from donated books in the back of the general store, and she ran it herself on Saturday afternoons, which was perhaps the most personally satisfying thing she did, watching people of all ages and backgrounds come in and leave with books under their arms. Paul had taken Robert with him on surveying trips since the boy was 10, teaching him the work of reading land with the same patient thoroughness that characterized everything Paul did. Robert at 12 could run a transit and read a topographic map, and calculate a grade with an accuracy that made older surveyors nod in surprised approval. He had his mother's mathematical instinct and his father's patience with precision, and both his parents understood, without needing to discuss it, that he would be fine. Cecilia at 7 was exactly the person she had always indicated she would be, certain and curious, and already, under Dr. Holt's informal tutelage, able to identify and name half the medicinal plants in the valley. Dr. Holt had no children of her own, and had taken to Cecilia with the warmth of a woman who had found an unexpected relationship that suited her perfectly, and she taught the girl with rigor and genuine respect for her intelligence, which Cecilia returned in kind. James was the one who surprised them, the one who had not announced himself in advance. He discovered books at age 6 with the totality of a person falling in love, and by the time he was 8, he had read everything in the lending library twice and was writing his own stories in a lined notebook that he carried everywhere. He wrote about the valley and the mountains and the creek and the families he knew, and once he showed his mother a story about a woman who had crossed 2 mountains alone in a wagon, which he had written from the various things he had heard over the years, and which was not entirely accurate historically, but which had captured something essential about the spirit of it that made her sit very still for a long moment before she said anything. "Did I get it wrong?" he asked, watching her read. "No," she said. "You got the important parts exactly right." He beamed, and she hugged him, this child of hers who had arrived last and who she was increasingly convinced would be the one who wrote it all down. The farm in 1890 was 12 years old and in full maturity. The orchards on both the south and north slopes produced fruit enough to supply the whole valley and several in the county beyond. The wheat field had been expanded and was now rented in part to a neighboring family who farmed it on shares, and the income from the whole operation was not large by the standards of what the big cattle operations produced, but it was reliable and sustainable, and it was theirs. She had built it from 40 acres of cattle-grazed land and a plot plan in her mother's trunk, and she had built it by working it with her own hands and thinking about it carefully, and not giving up when Buford Crane cut her fences, or when the late frost of 1881 took half the orchard blossoms, or when the dry year of 1885 made the wheat come in thin. She was 40 years old in 1890, and she did not feel old. She felt complete, which was different. There was not the restless incompleteness that had driven her, the sense that something important had not yet been addressed. Everything important had been addressed. Some of it had been hard and some had been easy, and all of it had been worth it. And she knew the difference between her mother's dream and her own life in a way she had not known when she set out. And the difference was that her life was larger than any single dream, hers or her mother's, because it had been made daily. In the making of meals and the teaching of children and the setting of fence posts and the mapping of creek water and the raising of apple trees and the long conversations by lamplight with a man who had asked her, once, what she wanted for herself, and had never stopped being interested in the answer. Paul was 42 and still the same in the important ways, the directness of him, the patience, the quality of attention that had always felt to her like the most personal form of respect. He was grayer at the temples now, and the lines at the corners of his eyes were deeper, and she found him, if anything, more beautiful than she had in the beginning, in the way that a landscape becomes more beautiful when you know it in all its weathers. He still asked her what she thought. He still listened when she answered. He still found reasons to bring her coffee in the mornings, and they still sat on the south steps sometimes in the evenings watching the light go off the mountains, and she still felt, in those moments, the particular and irreplaceable warmth of being known entirely by someone who chose, every day, to keep knowing you. She walked out one evening in early October to the apple orchard, as she had done every October for 12 years, to check the last of the fruit before the final harvest. The trees were enormous now relative to the saplings she had planted, their branches heavy and productive, the smell of ripe apples and fallen leaves rich in the cool air. She walked the rows slowly, checking each tree with the knowledge of someone who had tended them from the beginning and knew every one of them specifically. At the far end of the south orchard, where the slope leveled before it rose again toward the mountains, she stopped and turned and looked back toward the house. She could see the lights in the windows, the warm yellow of the oil lamps that Robert had been lobbying to replace with kerosene lanterns, a debate that was ongoing. She could see the silhouette of Paul moving in the kitchen window, could see the smaller silhouette of James at the table with his inevitable notebook, could see the glow of the fireplace through the bedroom window where Cecilia had put herself to bed early because she had a book she could not put down. Her mother had bought this land and never seen it. She had seen it, and she had made it, and it was real, and it held the people she loved. And the trees she had planted were producing fruit, and the orchard went on in the evening air around her, fragrant and alive. The evidence of 12 years of care made visible in bark and branch, and the last heavy apples hanging in the dusk. She took one from the nearest branch, a late winesap, good and firm in her hand, and she bit into it, and it tasted of the valley, of creek water and mountain air and good soil and years of sun. And she stood among her mother's dream and her own life, both things true at once and neither one diminishing the other. And she was content in the deepest and most permanent sense of the word. Content in the way of a person who has found the right place and the right life and the right person to share it with, and who knows it and is grateful and does not take a single autumn evening for granted. She walked back through the orchard to the house where the lights were on and the people she loved were waiting, and she was home.